Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hokyoji's Sunday Dharma Talks. Today we'll be hearing from Ryushin Jan Freier. Ryushin is a longtime practitioner who started practicing at MZMC in 1985. He received jukai there in 1988 and worked as tenzo and other mostly kitchen-related jobs until 1994. He attended Clouds-in-Water Zen Center for a couple of years, starting in 2002. In 2016, he became a member of both the Hokyoji and Compassionate Ocean Dharma Centers, and he gives Dharma talks at Compassionate Ocean when invited, and obviously here too. So, Ryushin?
Good morning. Am I loud enough? Okay, thanks for coming. Thanks for figuring out what time it is, given everything else that's going on in the world. Today I'd like to talk about kind of this exploration I've been doing with the works of Joan Didion. So how many people are familiar with Joan Didion? Oh, excellent. So when my wife died, I read the book, The Year of Magical Thinking, but I really can't remember any of it because I was pretty raw when I was reading that. But when Joan Didion died at the age of 87 on December 23rd, 2021, last year, and a lot of articles started showing up in my news feed, and then I found this Netflix documentary, which I highly recommend, done by her nephew, Griffin Dunn, called The Center Cannot Hold, which is a pretty famous quote from W.B. Yeats, fragment of one of his poems. So I highly recommend watching that if you have any interest in Joan Didion at all. So the reason that I'm kind of interested in Joan Didion is because of my interest in the text of trust in mind, faith in mind, because I think there's parallels there, and I don't think I have to stretch it too far to see that. Sometimes I know I stretch things a little far to see things, to see a pattern, but I don't think I'm stretching it too far here. So I'd like to start out with a quote from Trust in Mind, Faith in Mind. And we'll see where we go from there. Obey the nature of things, and you will walk freely and undisturbed. When thought is in bondage, the truth is hidden, for everything is murky and unclear. This burdensome practice of judging brings annoyance and weariness. What benefit can be derived from distinction and separation? So I know for a fact that I live a lot of time in being murky and unclear, and this burdensome practice of judging does bring annoyance and weariness. But the question is raised, what benefit can be derived from distinction and separation? Because there must be some benefit derived from it, because we do it all the time. Evolutionary biology would tell us there's some benefit to be derived from distinction and separation, but maybe we can live with some kind of integration. So I'd like to talk first of all about the training that Joan Didion had as a writer, because just as we're trained in Zen practice, she trained as a writer and kind of had a natural inclination. She started writing when she was 5 years old. And she says in various places that she writes in order to discover what she thinks. She really believes in the clarity of expression. And when she was a teenager, she would type out, because this was when she was a teenager, it was before there were word processors, before there were computers. She would type out the sentences of Ernest Hemingway to learn how sentences worked. And she's a big believer in the structure of sentences. The sequence of sentences contains the meaning. So you can say certain things in various ways in the same, in different sentences. So the sequence also contains the meaning. So she won a essay contest and got a position, entry-level position at Vogue magazine. And at Vogue magazine, she had an editor. So I'll read a little bit about that. Some of Didion's entrancing sentences are due to the influence of Aline Talmy. So I wanted to make sure we get the name of Aline Talmy in there because of this influence she had. Her editor at Vogue, whose perfection helped shape some of Didion's style. Talmy was tenacious, insisting that her writers find shocking and active verbs and precise, concise language. At first, she wrote captions, Talmy said, of working with Didion. I would have her write 300 to 400 words and then cut it back to 50. We wrote long and published short, and by doing that, Joan learned to write. So that's really, I find parallels there with, that's really hard work. I know just from writing software that it's really hard to give up anything you write in software. If people tell you, no, we don't need that, or that's written poorly, rewrite that. It's hard because you put yourself into that writing, and to change it kind of hurts. So that kind of hurt is also kind of what, when practice period, we were hearing about Chimyo and Dokai being told over and over again in monastic training, no, that's not right. You're not doing that right. You're not doing that right. You're not doing that right. Dokai said, without exaggeration, maybe some exaggeration, like 100 times a day, he would hear domo, no correct, not correct. So this is training. This is training to write 300 or 400 words and to cut it back to 50. That's not easy. It's not easy. So when she was at Vogue, she started working her way up. And in 1961, she wrote kind of a famous essay called On Self-Respect. So this is kind of the pun I have on my title of Joan Didion on Self. It's On Self-Respect. So this is where she became noticed by kind of national recognition. And for one thing, the person who was supposed to come up with this assignment failed to do so. So she came up with this in 2 sittings, it's said. And the context is also interesting to me because this is a women's fashion magazine, Vogue magazine. And so to come up with what she writes in this piece on self-respect is pretty startling. It's like 2 years before Betty Friedan came out with Feminine Mystique, but it's all about self-respect, and it's basically, turning things around for addressing her audience. So I'm going to read a bit of this. So that starts out, once in a dry season, I wrote in large letters across 2 pages of a notebook that innocence ends when one is stripped of the delusion that one likes oneself. So I think we can all relate to that in some way, that at least at some part in our life, we would have rather have been someone else. We'd rather be someone that we could like more. There were things that we'd like to be different. We'd like things to be better in some way. So innocence ends when one is stripped of the delusion that one likes oneself. Although now, some years later, I marvel that a mind on the outs with itself should nonetheless make painstaking record of its every tremor. I recall with embarrassing clarity the flavor of those particular ashes. It was a matter of misplaced self-respect. I had not been elected to Phi Beta Kappa. This failure could scarcely have been more predictable or less ambiguous. I simply did not have the grades, but I was unnerved by it. I had somehow thought of myself as a kind of academic Raskolnikov, curiously exempt from the cause and effect relationships that hampered others. So we may have trouble relating to this incident, but this is part of the new journalism where a writer brings themselves into the essay, into their reporting. And so this is had a big effect on her, and she realizes that this was delusion, that she somehow thought herself outside of cause and effect, which we're pretty familiar with. We're told about cause and effect all the time. Although even the humorless 19-year-old that I was must have recognized that the situation lacked real tragic stature, the day that I did not make Phi Beta Kappa nonetheless marked the end of something, and innocence may well have been the word for it. I lost the conviction that lights would always turn green for me, the pleasant certainty that those rather passive virtues which had won me approval as a child automatically guaranteed me not only Phi Beta Kappa keys, but happiness, honor, and love of a good man. And it lost a certain touching faith in the totem power of good manners, clean hair, and proved confidence. So this is kind of a turning point for all of us, I think, that just by being good, things aren't going to turn out good. I think we're kind of conditioned to believe that at some point, that just by being good, things are going to turn out good. It's not necessarily the case. To such doubtful amulets had my self-respect been pinned, and I faced myself that day with the nonplussed apprehension of someone who has come across a vampire and has no crucifix at hand. So she kind of lost that illusion. And so this is a big turning point, and I think it's a big turning point for all of us in some ways. So I really like this next sentence. Although to be driven back upon oneself is an uneasy affair at best, rather like trying to cross a border with borrowed credentials, it seems to me now the one condition necessary to the beginning of real self-respect. So this is to be driven back upon oneself. So this is a primary tenet of our practice. Be a lamp unto yourself. Try it and see. Don't believe anything you hear. Don't believe anything you say to yourself. Find out for yourself. You're driven back upon oneself. You have to sort it out yourself. Most of our platitudes notwithstanding, self-deception remains the most difficult deception. The tricks that work on others count for nothing in that well-lit back alley where one keeps assignations with oneself. No winning smiles would do here, no prettily drawn lists of good intention. One shuffles flashily but in vain through one's marked cards, the kindness is done for the wrong reasons, the apparent triumph which involved no real effort, the seemingly heroic act in which one had been shamed. The dismal fact is that self-respect has nothing to do with the approval of others. Who we are, after all, deceived easily enough, has nothing to do with reputation, which, as Rhett Butler told Scarlett O'Hara, is something people with courage can do without. I wish she hadn't put that reference to Gone with the Wind in there, because it's the worst movie ever made, in my opinion. But anyway, you can see where this is going. The dismal fact is that self-respect has nothing to do with the approval of others. This is a time, her audience are women who basically, at that time, 1961, their self-respect has a lot to do with the approval of others. And she's going against the grain here. She's telling people that self-respect has nothing to do with the approval of others. And so what does it have to do with? Well, first she tells us what it means if you don't have it. To do without self-respect, on the other hand, is to be an unwilling audience to one interminable documentary that deals one's failings, both real and imagined, with fresh footage spliced in for every screening. So there's all these things that you did wrong, all these things you just continuously know about, that if you don't have self-respect, you're just at a loss. All you see are the problems, all you see are the mistakes, all you see are the defects. Then she goes into, there's this idea that there's a common superstition that self-respect is a kind of charm against snakes, something that keeps those who have it locked in some unblighted Eden out of strange beds, ambivalent conversations, and trouble in general. It does not at all. It has nothing to do with the face of things, but concerns instead a separate peace, a private reconciliation. So this is the idea that if you have self-respect, somehow everything is going to be easy again. But it's not true. It's actually tougher. It's actually harder because you just put yourself on a path of constantly having to figure out what is going on. Where is the deception? Who am I pleasing? What part of me do I need to work with? What part of me cares about what I'm doing? And not seeking the approval of others, because seeking the approval of others, in her opinion, a lot of times involves deceit. You lie to yourself, you lie to others when you'd rather not be doing things. So she says that self-respect is something that our grandparents, whether or not they had it, knew all about. They had instilled in them young a certain discipline, the sense that one lives by doing things one does not particularly want to do, by putting fears and doubts to one side, by weighing immediate comforts against the possibility of larger, even intangible comforts. So I don't know if this is true about my grandparents, but my grandparents had really hard lives, much harder than my life. And I think there is a certain amount of discipline to that they had to put aside things they didn't wanted to do things they didn't want to do. My Uncle Bernard, for example, wanted to learn to play violin. Well, there was no way they could afford a violin. There's no way they could afford a piano. He became a steel worker in the open hearth furnace. The kind of self-respect is a discipline, a habit of mind that can never be faked, but can be developed, trained, coaxed forth. So this is kind of the discipline of sorting things out. To have that sense of one's own intrinsic worth, which constitutes self-respect, is potentially to have everything: the ability to discriminate, to love, and to remain indifferent, or we would prefer to say equanimous. To lack it is to be locked with oneself, paradoxically incapable of either love or indifference. If we do not respect ourselves, we are, on one hand, forced to despise those who have so few resources as to consort with us, so little perception as to remain blind to our fatal weaknesses. On the other hand, we are peculiarly enthralled to everyone we see, curiously determined to live out, since our self-image is untenable, their false notion of us. We flatter ourselves by thinking this compulsion to please others an attractive trait, a gist for imaginative empathy, evidence of our willingness to give. So this is a state that Joan Halifax talks about in her Edge State books of giving of yourself to kind of placate some notion of yourself, to grab some kind of self-respect. So without it, she talks about the phenomenon called alienation from self. In its advanced stages, we no longer answer the telephone because someone might want something that we could say no, without drowning in self-reproach is an idea alien to this game. Every encounter demands too much, tears the nerves, drains the will, and the specter of something as small as an unanswered letter arouses such disproportionate guilt that answering it becomes out of the question. So this is interesting. That sounds like she's talking from personal experience. And I can relate to this. In advanced stages, we no longer answer the telephone because someone might want something. So there was a time at MZMC when they discovered that my wife, Sandy, was a graphic artist and knew how to get things printed and knew how to typeset, do all this stuff. So we would get these calls, and every time it would be like 6 o'clock, 6:10. It was like they made sure you were home for supper, and they would call, and it was super annoying. And how could you say no? How could you say no? That's where that is at. So I think, in my opinion, this idea of self-respect is pretty radical at the time, 1961. But it's also has to do with faith in mind, that you have the ability to do this. You have the ability to stand on your own at some place. So people are still writing about this essay. If I looked all across the internet, and people are still writing about this essay because it's such a seminal essay. And this woman, Gabrielle Belote, from February 7th, 2020, talks about it. And she brings up Esme Wang, which has a lot to do with, I think, the same thing. So she says, I think too of what Esme Wang, for example, wrote of so disarmingly and devastatingly in the collected schizophrenias. So Esme Wang eventually was diagnosed with a schizoaffective disorder. So she writes about this in this book called The Collective Schizophrenias. So what wrote of so disarmingly and devastatingly in the collected schizophrenias of the bleak abyss of fear that being unable to trust one's perceptions can create. Wang writes boldly of something akin to Didion, of having self-respect by being real about what the schizophrenias are and what it means to take a stand and not to succumb to that abyss of terror. So that's I think what faith in mind is talking about as well, of being able to take that stand. And we can call it self-respect, or we can call it trust in mind, or we can call it something else. But it's turning the lamp upon yourself, being a lamp unto yourself, trusting yourself. And it's critical. And I think it just occurred to me this weekend that Stephen Batchelor talks about secular Buddhism as just kind of this ethical practice. And I think this is the heart of it, is having this trust in yourself, having this kind of self-respect. So she wrote that when she was 24 years old. And then I don't know exactly what her career path was after that, but she found that she was blocked as a writer, and she realized that the block was because she feared disorder. So she decided, because there was a lot of disorder in the world, in California where she lived, born and raised, and so she knew that she had to face the disorder to continue. So she started writing essays about. She hung out with the hippies, and she hung out with the Hollywood crowd. And she's a small person, so she's very unobtrusive and not very intimidating. So people just kind of let her hang out around things. So she hit the disorder. She went at the disorder, and she tried to use her writing to tell her what she was thinking. So it looks like I'm only going to get to this 2 of the 3, but this is good. This is good stuff. In 1974, she wrote a graduation speech at the University of California, Riverside. So this is after she wrote a lot of essays and had them published as 2 books on kind of this, on the counterculture, on the California culture. She wasn't especially, she didn't like the foolishness of the 60s very much. But this, I really, really like. This graduation speech is listed in a number of places as one of the 10 greatest graduation speeches. Anyway, this is a portion of it. So these are her words. And you can tell that the writing is a little different because it's to be spoken, not to be read. I had to struggle all my life against my own misapprehensions, my own false ideas, my own distorted perceptions. I have had to work very hard, make myself unhappy, give up ideas that made me uncomfortable, give up ideas that made me comfortable, trying to apprehend social reality. So this is her job, is understanding social reality. Our job is understanding reality. I've spent my entire adult life, it seems to be, in a state of profound culture shock. I wish I were unique in this, but I'm not. You may not be afflicted with my misapprehensions, and I may not be afflicted with yours, but none of this starts tabula rasa. We all distort what we see. We all have to struggle to see what's really going on. That's the human condition, providing the human is awake and living in the world, which, by the way, is not as automatic as you might think, but I'll get to that in a minute. Some of you are going to spend the whole rest of your life in culture shock. And what I'm saying today is what I think all of you should. I'm talking about trying not to be crippled by ideas. I'm talking about looking out at the world and trying to see it straight, about making that effort to look out for the whole rest of you, and I'm not going to tell you that today you begin to live in the world, because, as I said before, I don't think that happens automatically. Some of you live in the world already, and some of you never will. It takes an active will to live in the world, which is what I'm talking about today. By living in the world, I mean really trying to see it, look at it, trying to make connections. So that's kind of bold to tell some people you're never going to get it. And that's not easy. It takes work. You have to keep stripping yourself down, examining everything you see, getting rid of whatever is blinding you. And sometimes when you get rid of what's blinding you, you get your eyes open. You don't like what you see at all, and that's the risk. It's much easier to live in a world you imagined, at heaven haven where springs not fail, a world in which the questions fit the answers and the answers fit the questions. The connections are already made, a world in which everything fits neatly into some idea or ideology. But that kind of world is only easier for a little while. It cripples people who live in it, and it's also dangerous in a bad way. It's dangerous to the society, it's dangerous to your own soul, and sometimes it's even physically dangerous. When you rock around blinded long enough, someday you're going to fall off that precipice that I mentioned you were on the brink of. I don't need to give you a lot of literary examples of why living by an idea alone is dangerous, because you can probably think of more than I can. All I want to tell you today is really is not to do that, not to move into that world where you're alone with yourself. I want to tell you to live in the messy world. Throw yourself into the convolution of the world. I'm not telling you to make the world better because I don't think that progress is necessarily part of the package. That's quite a statement to people who are graduating from college. I'm not telling you to make the world better because I don't think that progress is necessarily part of the package. I'm just telling you to live in it, not just to endure it, not just to suffer it, not just to pass through it, but to live in it, to look at it, to try to get the picture, to live recklessly, to take chances, to make your own work and take pride in it, to seize the moment. And ask me why you should bother to do that. I could only tell you that the graves and fine and private place, but none, I think, do their embrace, which is probably something we've all heard. Nor do they sing there or write or argue or see the tidal bore on the Amazon or touch their children. And that's where there is to do and get while you can, and good luck at it. So she's an Episcopalian. Somewhere in that self-respect thing, it also says people with self-respect take responsibility for their mistakes. We can make mistakes. I want to tell a little story about a practice period. So people were making mistakes. So one day, the water offering on the altar, the water offering for Katagiri Roshi on the altar, I'm not sure when this happened, but now it's the responsibility of the timekeeper, because the timekeeper somehow has responsibility for the altars. So I'm not sure, but I don't think that was always the case. I thought it was the Jisha's task to do that. But so I made a mistake the first day I was timekeeper, and I didn't do it right, and I really kind of messed up. And then one day, Kim was timekeeper, and Kim didn't know about the water offering, and so it just sat there on the altar. It wasn't fresh water. It wasn't up on the shelf to be taken by the Jisha. It was already on the altar. So after Zazen, I went to Kim and I said, Kim, you made a mistake. You're supposed to have fresh water in the water offering and have it up on the shelf. And Kim said, oh, the pressure. So that's my talk for today.
Do we want to open it up for comments, questions? Carl, Hartman?
Well, several things came up to me. The reason the timekeeper at Hokyoji does the altar is because for a lot of time there were like 3 of us sitting in the morning and doing morning service, and so we didn't have a Jisha, and the timekeeper, I was often the timekeeper and the doan, and so you just, it got to be a habit anyway. The beginning of your talk, when you're talking about how she's learning to write concisely and to write 400 or 500 words and then shrink it to 50, I found that really interesting. And I had just read a thing. There's a news service, an internet news service called Axios, AXIOS, and it's they cover Washington and all of this stuff. It's a major one. But they have software that you can buy that condenses the writing of your organization down to like PowerPoint phrases. And it's artificial intelligence to condense your writing down so that you're using impact words and nothing superfluous, or, you know, and they sell this to large companies. I mean, it's, anyway, it was pretty funny that that's the way it came in. But you've intrigued me to learn more about Joan Didion, and I've known her name, but I have not read her stuff, but looks like I'm going to have to. So anyway, thanks.
When I got my first real corporate job in an engineering environment, I was still influenced by being in a liberal arts education. Being in a liberal arts education, you tend to puff up your words so that you make the impression that you know a lot more than you do. Well, that did not fly in an engineering environment at all. And I was taken aside by my boss. It's, you know, just the facts. And he gave me, you know, a little book, Elements of Style, which is handed down probably over and over again. So it really, you know, really trimmed my my wordage to just get the facts out as quickly as possible, because engineers they have a different way of, they're not interested in knowing what you think you know. They're interested exactly what you know. So, but that's hard. And I've seen it in software where people write just these beautiful things that they're so proud of, and then they say, no, we can't implement that in this release. What? So they refuse to extract it. They'll just put comment blocks around it, so it's there if anybody wants to use it. I put a lot into that code. I'm not gonna delete it.
Just quickly, just saying, in school, you often have a word requirement. You need to have 500 words or 5 pages or whatever. So you can be done, and then you got to add a whole bunch of fluff or make your handwriting bigger if it was, you know, way back. But just interesting that school teaches you to add fluff, but good writing always teaches you to go back and cut, including the parts that you're kind of in love with.
I have a couple things. This reminded me of when we were writing my mother's obituary over 5 years ago. My youngest sister, Amy, she said, she's Ernest Hemingway and I'm Virginia Woolf. And we had to struggle with my wordiness and her very short, precise sentences. And it came out beautifully. But anyway, but I wanted to say how fascinating what you brought forth here about self-respect and self-delusion. I've always thought of self-respect as self-acceptance and not being hard on yourself and not being shame-based, you know, all those things that we do in therapy. And but the part about self-delusion as being part of true self-respect is that's the path. And I never thought of it that way. So thank you for talking about this.
So the book that won all the awards is The Year of Magical Thinking. So what happened in the year, her husband died suddenly at the dinner table while her daughter was in the ICU with pneumonia and sepsis and in a coma. So she's just devastated. So she wrote this book because she couldn't find any book on grief that described what she was going through, the complete absence of meaning, the complete loss. And while she's doing this, she has all this training as an investigative reporter. But the reason it's magical thinking is because she continues to have this idea that her husband is coming back. She can't give away his clothes. She can't give away his shoes. She just looks at those and she continues to have this delusion. She realizes she's of two minds. She's this rational investigating thing, but she continues to have this delusion. And so she investigates this delusion. And it's just, it's interesting that you can have this quality of mind that you realize, I'm thinking like a child. How can that be? And within, I don't know, I think she started writing the book 9 months after her husband died. And then 9 months after that, or at some point it took like 9 months for this delusion just to lift. And the reason the delusion is there is because it's too hurtful. It's too painful not to have it. She needed to hold on to him somehow. And so writing the book was another way of holding on to him. And it's like, it was very difficult to finish the book. So when she toured, this is part that really gets me. When she toured, she was surprised how many people were showing up for the book tour to hear her reading. And she thought she had written a book about grief. But there were so many women in the audience, and they let her know that she had written a book about marriage. She had written a book about relationship. So I think delusion is, we're constantly, once you go on this path of self-acceptance, you're constantly having to work on delusion. It's much easier in some ways to let other people tell you who you are, but you're gonna get buffeted all over the place. It's much harder to have a kind of a stand, take a stand, but then you're committing yourself to this life of constantly working out what is real. And I think that's why we sit and we're still to figure out what is real.
I just want to say what delusion and death and accepting it, and how she needed to keep the clothes and the shoes. My brother-in-law died suddenly last week. He struggled a lot with mental illness and addiction. And we saw his body on Monday. And I'm realizing for the people close to me that have died, I really have to be with the body, because, it makes it real. But it struck me that my body knew his body. You know what I mean? Like in my mind, it's abstract. He's dead. He's not in this body anymore. But there's something about 30 years interacting with this human being where the body has its own stuff going on. We say in Buddhism, get beyond your intellect, and there's all this other stuff. And that was a comforting idea to me anyway, to just be with his body. And I had to touch it, and it was cold and hard. And it was maybe morbid, but it was part of my, it's still shocking, and I'm still working on acceptance. But anyway, there's just a lot of layers to loss and separation.
So I think one part of your talk that just fascinates me is that she wrote that one essay in 1961, like you said, when women were being disrespected, and saying their respect didn't depend on what other people thought of them. And it made me think of this TV show Christian and I are watching right now with the surgeons in a hospital, and the head surgeon is male. And at times he unwittingly is disrespectful to the female surgeons or female nurses in ways he's not really even aware of. Even one of the female surgeons is told she needs to be more assertive. But then when she is, she's told she's being insubordinate. So it made me think, when she gave these talks, how many women may have just gotten up and walked out of the room, because that's just more part of the oppression. I'm not supposed to, what other people, it's all, my self-respect comes from me. It doesn't matter what other people think. And like, well, it does matter. But the message that your self-respect doesn't depend on what other people think is very valid. It's like both messages need to get out there. Like, yes, it does matter that you're disrespected, but it doesn't. I don't know. I'm just curious how her talks back then were received. It just seems like some women would have just gotten up and walked out of the room.
Yeah, that was an essay in the magazine, and I thought, what an odd place to put that essay in a woman's fashion magazine. And like, yeah, I don't know what the reaction would have been to that, but it got national attention. That's for sure. But someone who knows more about magazine culture than I do said that Condé Nast, if that's how you say it, their publications they feel like they have an obligation to uplift their audience, even if they're selling them trinkets and perfumes and high fashion. They still feel the want to uplift their audience. But 1961 was a long time ago.
Jan, what was the title of that essay?
On self-respect.
Okay, I'd like to look it up. I want to thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have been a fan of Joan Didion's since my father gave me this book in 1967. And when I saw you were going to speak on Joan Didion, I went and got all my Joan Didion books out, and I started reading it again. My favorite essay is Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And it's a line out of the Yeats poem, which I revere that poem. That poem is so pertinent on a personal, cultural, social, intellectual level right now with everything that's going on in the world. I loved your talk on an individual level, but I have been rereading that poem, oh my God, so many times with the political situation in Ukraine and the center not holding and the Falcon not, hearing the falconer. It's just so pertinent. And her essay, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, is on a cultural basis is just so timely, I think. So I want to thank you.
It's interesting to me how these essays, she had such insight that they continue to reverberate. And she was so
right. Yeah.
She was so bold.
Yeah.
For such a just a petite little person.
Yeah.
And she knew, she grew up talking about being in fear, and yet she was so fearless.
Yeah. She was, yeah. I read that book, The Year of Magical Thinking, when my father died in I think it came out after he passed away, but it was so helpful. I was very grief-stricken with his death. I still carry a lot of emotion about about losing him, although I could speak a lot about the feeling of that loss. But that book was so important to me. I think it's such a marvelous book on loss. And then the book after that, which I think is called Blue Moon.
Blue Nights.
Blue Nights. Yeah, that was a marvelous book too, because it was sort of a discussion looking back on what she had been going through in the year of magical thinking. I thought it was just an amazing work. And
the Blue Nights also has to do with eventually her adopted daughter died.
Right. Quintana Rue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that was a tough story.
When my wife died, I felt pretty crazy for 3 to 4 months. I felt like nothing made much sense.
Yeah.
And I think she was even further out than I was. Because I had things to do, and I didn't have as much trouble getting rid of things because there was so much stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
But I've made a pledge not to talk about grief and loss quite so much because it's the only topic that makes sense to me. But after listening to Chimyo and Dokai talk about training in Japan, I realized there's a parallelism between what you can learn from grief and loss and what you learn from monastic hard training. And it's like, the ego, when people tell you you're doing something wrong all the time, where do you stand? It's not, you can't stand on your ego anymore, but you still have, and you're never praised for doing something right. You just know that you're doing something right because nobody's yelling at you. So it's like, where do you stand? Where do you learn to stand? And some people never, Chimyo said, some people never learn to stand at the right place. But it's the same kind of thing. It's like, you have that resource. And it's the same thing with grief and loss. You can look at it. It's okay. It doesn't destroy you.
What is the name of the Yeats poem you both were referring to?
The Second Coming by Yeats.
Okay.
Yeah. And boy, wonderful poem. It's definitely in my top 2 poems.
It was interesting to me for someone who was so concentrated on words and sentence structure and stuff. In the movie, when Griffin Dunn is interviewing her, she begins to move her hands around. It's like the words don't have enough meaning. She has to tweak them with her hands, and it's just beautiful.
Yeah, there's a lot of interviews with Joan Didion on Bookworm, Michael Silverblatt, which you can go to KCRW and look at the archives and listen to them. She is absolutely fascinating. Michael Silverblatt, the book reviewer for, I think, the last 40 years for KCRW, was such a fan of hers. So she was on his show maybe 3 or 4 times a year. So there's tons of interviews with her, which I continue to find really fascinating. You might enjoy them.
So so there were a lot of things that came up, but I will stick to some I think it's interesting that she learned to write by typing out Hemingway, because it's actually a very classical practice that we don't do much anymore. And certainly in a lot of the Asian arts, that's exactly how you learn. You learn by copying masters over and over and over again. They do it a little bit more in art, but I don't think we think of that much in writing. I
In
think
jazz, I'll just interject. In jazz, people learn by doing transcripts. People transcribe Charlie Parker.
Other people's, right?
Yeah, people learn, how to play instruments by transcribing what the great masters have done. So it was really interesting practice to me. So, and it's the same thing with scripture. It's like people recite sutras over and over. People write them out. So, sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. No. I was gonna, and I think that, so the other interesting thing was the 300 words, 3,000 words, down to 50. That actually most of good writing is in the editing. It's not actually in, I mean, I think sometimes people who don't write a lot think, oh, you just type and the words come out, but that's not where it is. Most of good writing is in the editing. And then I only want to add that I love my code, and I do not like to see it deleted. But on the other hand, I know that for every line of code you remove, there is one less potential bug. So, also to add, and probably Ryushin is the only other person who will get this, is you have the opposite problem sometimes of code golf, where you try to do things in so few lines that you can't understand what it's doing.
Oh, yeah.
So can I say something
one
quick?
more?
Oh yeah. Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's funny, you're talking about transcripts. I really resonated with that, doing the Katagiri transcripts project, because for each talk, I listened to it probably over 6, as many as 10 times, to get down what he's actually saying, and, like making increasingly more subtle corrections to the transcripts each time. And for me, it's been like, that's the first time I've really felt like I've started like absorbing some of this material is going over these talks 10 times. I'm actually starting to understand certain things for the first time. So I just find it fascinating that for me, at least, and it sounds like more generally for at least a lot of people, it seems like that is an effective technique for actually starting to learn certain things. Hello. And Ryushin, I really like Luna likes to be part of the conversation here. Yeah, Ryushin, I really like your quote. I actually wrote this down, that engineers aren't interested in what you think you know. They're interested in exactly what you know. As an engineer myself, I have to admit, knowing a lot of engineers, I'm not sure that's entirely true all of the time. But I think it's, in a way, it's like a really noble aspiration. So I like that. I wrote that down. Anyway, thank you for your talk.
All right. Thank you so much, Ryushin. That takes us to the end of the talk today. Let me just, let's see, we need to do the things here. I'm going to switch out. Yes, so thank you for joining our Sunday talk today. Next Sunday, I believe, is going to be Reverend Onru Kennedy. And the title of her talk, it should be interesting if it meshes with today's discussion. Does Zen need a center? Engaging the way. So we were talking about the center not holding. Maybe we don't need a center. So maybe we'll find out. Thank you, everyone, for your generosity. Hokyoji is supported by everyone here and members like you and benefactors and patrons. And I'm going to put in the chat a donation link. But we recognize that many of you donate throughout the year, and we appreciate it very much. You can also follow us on social media. And this is the question I didn't want to get into is I wonder what Joan Didion would think about social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and you can follow, you can subscribe on YouTube where you can see recordings of these talks. Please help us spread the word about Hokyoji. Bring a friend to a Dharma talk. And I want to thank you again. And to close, we'll chant the 4 vows together. And so we'll start. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we hope to see you next week.